Hello, everyone, and here we are again, as promised, which is good. Discipline, uh, promises, keeping promises, and we even have Daniel joining us. So, welcome. If you're still watching, you're a trooper. Uh, I want to start off with having us in a nice picture. And secondly, I want to draw attention to the creator of our awesome background. Uh, he's been hanging around on Discord on and off. And I put his Instagram in the description, so he gets the full credit, even though I suck at these things. Um, so yeah, thanks for allowing us these awesome pictures. Like he goes to the deserts and he puts like this whole camera settings up there, so he doesn't have the light pollution and all that stuff. And then he has like big ass computer processing done afterwards to light up the relevant parts and change the wavelength of the light because I'm fairly certain this is all not visible light, but it's on a different spectrum. So if you're interested in more of these awesome pictures, they're available on his Instagram. So moving away from the heavens to different heavens, I've been trying to figure out, well, what's the lens, what's the setup um, that I'm using to relate to the heavens. What is mediating, and how do I relate to that, right? Like how do I get to change that? Because obviously we're all misattuned on some level, or lack of attuning is probably more accurate. Um, and yeah, like so what do you do? Well, like you need to value things differently, like the things that come at you, and you need to see things in them, so that they draw you in. Um, and yeah, that's a really complicated dance, which I think you shouldn't do. Like I think I keep doing everything the wrong way around. You should just grow into them. But sometimes you're already grown, and you need to ungrow a little bit. Um, so one of the things that I was thinking about is, um, I and Mark mention often that you can't see yourself, right? Like you can't really see what you're doing uh, because you're blind to the things that you're blind to. But I realized that there is something like a footprint that you leave, right? So you can walk um, through what you did, and you can say, okay, like this is the way that I affected everything, and what is the thing that I didn't include in that, right? And usually, hopefully, you get those things by feedback from other people, right? So that you don't have to worry about that. But in some sense, your footprint tells you a bunch of about yourself, right? Where do you put your weight, things like that. Um, are you overburdened, or do you carry a light load, stuff like that. So there's some reflection uh, that is possible in that space. And also, I guess I wanna get more into the reflection of, okay, like I know I have certain modalities, right? So like what draws me into them, or better yet, what keeps me out, right? Because even if you get drawn in, you, you 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 don't necessarily have means to counteract that, especially if you don't have an alternative to them. So yeah, that's kind of the the way that I connected to my intention today. I do think that uh, in my practical participation, I left more space for things to happen. So I was just willing to let things yeah unfold instead of trying to partake in them in whatever manner. Um, so there's a I guess an acceptance and from that acceptance a new participation or hopefully a better participation can arise. Um, yeah. So Christopher, you're up next.
Okay, yeah. I have labeled my intention as a insider, not gold, as a contrast to Nebuchadnezzar that we're going to be jumping in on here, and also with a movie from the 80s. So it said stay gold, and I think that's probably more wrong than right. Um, yeah, just trying to think about how I'm participating in things and how to do that a little bit better from where I am instead of where I want to be, maybe. So, um, Alina?
Um, my intention is to kind of just understand how other people relate to the things talked about in chapter 54 of the integration of heaven and earth and time and space within an individual and what patterns they might see um, within themselves with these types of things, just so I could figure out how to apply that to myself. Awesome.
Sure. So I kind of have my thing here is Castle Incorporated, agent of integration. So I know we're going to be going a little bit into this sort of incorporating or integrating aspect. My intention's a little bit similar to Christopher's. So the sort of aspect of integration, while also to Manuel's point, not trying to like seize the integration. That's something we'll be exploring here in this first chapter today, of Nebuchadnezzar making that mistake. This sort of aspect of, when there's proper integration, you shouldn't be, I should say, like, the word detachment. You can say it's like not seizing by law. So you can enjoy the participation in the thing without having to possess or own it or anything like that. And in fact, it's when you stop trying to have or own the thing that you actually wind up having that. And I had this interesting sort of experience where, a lot of my intentions and titles have been pretty gloomy for the last, like, 6 to 8 weeks or something like that, because I was very reflective of my experience, and it was topical also to the book club. And interestingly, as we're getting into the ornamentation and the kind of wrapping things up in a sense, I'm seeing a lot of the issues that I was experiencing. Maybe there's a new cycle coming, I'll have to be ready, but there's a lot of these things are kind of getting wrapped up and sealed off. And I'm noticing a lot of these unusual integrations where I've been experiencing being kind of like a perpetual foreigner in a lot of the environments that I kind of operate in. And I was fine with that. It's actually, there's a lot of advantages to that. And then all of a sudden I'm being kind of like integrated without my actual desire or like my consent is there, but I didn't ask for it. And I kind of feel a little bit like timid about accepting. But there's suddenly a lot of people that are like, hey, actually, we need you to do this. And like, there's no one else to do this. And so you're here and you show that you could do it once. So we're going to have you do it every time, more or less. And I'm like, I'm here to do it. And I'm fine with that, but I'll be exploring live a little bit, and as we do some of these chapters, I don't know if I'll explain all of my insights, or some of them will happen days later, but a little bit of that aspect of what integration looks like and how you can kind of manage that without having to turn that entire statue into gold, and still be an insider, even if you're, clay and iron or something like that. Danny, would you like?
Yeah. So last week I was sort of, it felt as though the book was sort of approaching a bit of a crescendo, and I was just sort of trying to make sense of some of these loftier pictures that are being built. I still feel that way. I'm quite excited about this part of the book and reading ahead a little bit as he's getting more into time. I don't quite know how to make sense of a lot of what I've been reading, but so I'm still exploring. I guess I don't have a clear intention other than some of the themes that related to time that I was kind of, my mind was gravitating towards was repercussion, and thinking about repercussion of decisions and actions. And so like for in this chapter, for example, the perspective I'm gonna try to take is like imagining, for example, what it's like to be in the state of defiance, like as Nebuchadnezzar, for example, is erecting the statue in defiance. Just sort of I'm going to kind of just trying to think about time and the influence of time through the lens of repercussion by imagining the themes that come up. Like, yeah, that's it. Back to you, Manuel.
Yeah, thank you. That reminded me about a Bible study that I had, and basically someone was calling out to Jesus, and in the calling out to Jesus, a bunch of things happened, right? Like so he got quieted by the mob, and then he shouted louder, right? And I identify that as a Kairos moment, right? Like the moment where new possibility opens up. And so thinking of time in that sense, right? Like there's moments where you you in Dutch we say confess suit, right? Like you show your true colors, right? That's um, and you don't show your own colors to yourself, but you also show your colors to the world, right? And then after uh, he's shown his colors, that's where Jesus reaches out and praises his faith and says, "By your faith you're healed." Right. So there's an interaction between the calling out, the response, and the affirmation, and then the manifestation. Like I'm not quite sure on how that exactly worked, but the thing I did realize is um, it's important that the dance is had, right? It's not a one-way street. Like you get affirmation, you get invitation, you ask all of these things, and they unfold in a manner, right? And so if we look at time, right, it's like um, in the Bible there's eras or whatever or generations or whatever, and all of these things they're seeds of a new time in some sense, right? And so it's like there's this Kairos moment where the rules of the game change just because something happened, right? Like things are never going to be the same. Like you can say the same thing about the crucifixion, right? Like now it is done, right? Like you've proven what you do. Before that, like there was always the possibility for you not to do it, right? And I'm also seeing that in life, right? Like you know where things go, but you still have to have them happen, right? And if you intercede before they happen, now that might be good, and that might be bad, depending on how, when, and what. And that's also what I'm trying to figure out, right? Because like if you intercede, that means that you're stepping in front of someone. So if you step in front of someone, that means that you're not giving them the opportunity to learn in the manner that they would have, right? And so like if the learning kills them in a way, that's a good thing. If the learning well, if it denies the learning, now you're keeping them small, right? And you can see the helicopter parent aspect. So and yeah, I don't know where to introduce this, so I'm just going to do this up front. So I was reading a bit, and I don't know how justified it is, but I have the sense that Matthieu Pageau might be using loaded language, right, which is has a moral implication. Um, and well, we definitely know that that's happening in the culture, right? That we use. Well, one of the loaded terms would be opposition, right? Like it would mean that there's an implication of the type of relationship, right? And if you just say that they're in relationship without qualifying the type of relationship, now you get to say, well, whether the relationship is a good thing or a bad thing as a consequence of what happens in the relationship, instead of presuming that the relationship is either good or bad. Because if you're working uh, on the fundamental level that he is, right, I think it's really important to realize that well, the good version of a relationship is always a subset of that relationship, right? So um, it's it's just cleaner to talk about the superset in general, unless there's specific qualifications for the good version, right? Like then it's obviously warranted. So that was something that popped up in my mind. I don't know if you guys feel like that was justified, because I don't know if that was justified.
Well, I definitely like the bit about the intercession and like kind of having to discern like when that's actually appropriate, because you have the aspect of like, you know, Jordan Peterson makes the statement of, oh, you know, never do something for someone that they could do for themselves, but at the same time, like, you know, if that person is actually never going to do it and like the thing needs to get done, like also you kind of have to intercede at a certain point, and that's something that I've experienced in my own life of this thing of trying to do that. Okay, like this person's going to do it, and then like a couple of weeks go past and they don't, and there's kind of a deadline or there's consequences to that thing not getting done. And so there's that. But I've also kind of experienced this with, you know, I make these little flatbreads sometimes, and you can kind of see this thing where most of the time you there's a certain amount of time that you put it in, and you do the same ingredients and the same setup the entire time, but you might make, you know, 20 breads, and 1 out of 20 will have like this unusual bubble that'll just happen because of the way it was mixed or something like that, and while it's in the oven it'll just rise up so high that the bubble gets to the top of the oven and just starts burning, and like it doesn't catch on fire, but it just becomes like just this blackened burnt bit. So it's actually necessary to go in there, rotate it, flatten the bubble and everything like that. Like when there's this kind of, you know, it's getting, you know, the bread is getting too big for its britches or something like that. You know, you have to kind of flatten it down, you know, and rotate it in order to get things right. But most of the time, if you interfere too soon, like you are going to have an underbaked or, you know, damaged thing, or especially if you're making like something that's supposed to have a smooth surface like a pie, like it'll wind up cracking if you open that oven even like an hour too soon or something like that.
Okay, I'm getting a call. Castle, can you start it off?
So we'll go ahead and get started here with chapter 52. So we have this bit at the beginning, the excerpt from the book of Daniel. Whoever does not worship the image will cast into a fiery furnace. Will be cast into a fiery furnace. What God shall deliver you? So he describes here that in chapter 3 of that book, Nebuchadnezzar attempts to prevent the catastrophic outcome that he sees in his dream of, you know, his kingdom being this great kingdom that eventually gets taken down by a foreign kingdom and is eventually disintegrated after multiple iterations of these succeeding kingdoms. And he attempts to prevent it by performing a microcosm of creating the statue entirely of gold rather than of the descending categories of then silver and then copper and iron and clay, and then forcing people to participate in that, even when there's music or sound of any kind. And if they don't do it, then they're going to be subject to extreme space. So if they're not going to worship Nebuchadnezzar in his golden form, which is just like the height of pride, that they'll wind up themselves being consumed in flame, and it's this extreme over encroachment of like kind of trying to dominate by space that's taking place there. And something that I thought was kind of interesting is that it was actually so hot. It's not mentioned here, but in the book, it's actually mentioned that when they go to send Daniel and his friends into, it was Daniel's companions into the furnace, It was actually so hot that the people that sent them into the furnace themselves caught on fire and burned alive. And yet the ones that were actually thrown in survive. And so before I continue, does anyone have any comments?
No, that was, yeah. Nebuchadnezzar is doing the extreme space thing. He's used, fire to cast this golden image, and if you don't bow down and worship it, then you're one of the impurities that needs to be burned out also. That was,
yeah. It's this kind of complete, where we were talking about like the nice ornamentation and like the kind of finishing things off or sealing them off with song and decoration and those sorts of things. It's just like all of it is going to be serving all this stuff, and it's not. Normally the ornamentation is something that is actually put on top, like we talked about crowns and like Christmas tree ornaments and those sorts of things, whereas everything has to kneel to this stuff, so it's all at the bottom. And this, like, the head has become so large that it's just encompassed the entire body, and now everything else is like shrunk to these tiny little things. So we have, and then we have the aspect of last week we talked a little bit of this aspect of you look into the abyss long enough and eventually it looks back, and that's sort of the looking low aspect. But we're also seeing this now of kind of like trying to do the Tower of Babel thing, like building your way to heaven, and you reach the limit of that as well, and it also looks back, and there's this kind of aspect of judgment that takes place there. And if you're not properly aligned, like, you wind up getting reduced in some sort of way by and this is also that sort of forced integration thing, where that if someone lifts you up to a place, then that's perfectly fine. Like, say if you go to the if you're invited to the penthouse suite of a hotel or something like that, then that's a very pleasant thing. But if you sneak in and break into that room, then you wind up getting reduced all the way down and maybe go to jail or something like that. So there's this sort of thing of like trying to take the absolute highest thing, and then you get the whole like, I see Satan fall like lightning type of issue. Something I thought was interesting. So there's this bit where when the companions survive the fire, Nebuchadnezzar goes and proclaims that if anybody curses the God that saved them, that they themselves would be destroyed and that their houses will be destroyed and everything. And he says that when he sees the companions in the fire, there's a fourth person that shows up, and he says, this person looks like the son of gods or something like that. And in the early church father tradition, like with Saint Irenaeus specifically, he actually says outright that like this was actually the son of God that is in there with them. So he kind of goes a lot into further detail. I don't remember if it was in Against Heresies or the Demonstration of the Apostolic Teaching, but he goes into greater detail of how that is actually kind of the presence of God, in the same way that he says, when two or more of you are gathered in my name, that I'll be there with you. And this is that sort of aspect of, you are so like as Matthieu kind of calls it, the meta space, that when you're no longer simply operating in just the time cycle or just the space cycle, you get so far out to that limit of integration that you are actually still you're participating in that higher principle.
I want to ask a quick question on a comment you made about integration. So you said that when the earth is brought up, is raised up and not and doesn't take for itself. That's one sort of integration. Do you think there are other types of ways to integrate, or is that kind of the main one?
So, as far as I understand the question, it's that is it the case that the only way you can integrate into what Matthieu calls the meta space when you are when matter is raised up? It is that what you mean?
No. when there's the lowering of earth and there's the lowering of heaven and the raising of earth, um, for the unity of the symbol there. When that's done, um, can you repeat your point on the way that um, earth is raised into a unity, and that's done when it's raised from heaven, which makes sense. That sort of integration is kind of like a one directional. Is that the main one?
So there is this little aspect that is kind
I'm
of.
sorry, I'm asking a question.
No, you're fine. I think this is something that it's a little difficult to escape, because like if everything is emanated, that there is this kind of aspect of everything coming down, but not necessarily is all of it like a heavenly emanation. So there's this kind of difficulty of, okay, if heaven and earth both are emanating down in a sense from God, then there is this aspect of, okay, everything is kind of coming down. But also then there's the interaction between heaven and earth. So you have the kind of emanating from heaven, and then you have the raising up, or like the powerful support from below, from earth. So there's something that kind of comes to mind for me a little bit is, like, we've been talking a lot about symbols as this kind of union of heaven and earth. And for the folks at home, the Franciscan friars have, after St. Francis of Assisi, they have this tradition where he called it a sacramental worldview. So it's this idea of like actually, and this is actually in a sense kind of like a metaspace version of the symbol. So you could describe symbols in more or less, even though we're working within a religious context here, you can describe them in sort of a secular sense. Like Matthieu is very much trying to reach a wider audience here, so he's using a lot of secular language to achieve that. And so the further yet more religious terminology that could be used is the old Franciscan terminology of the sacramental worldview. So it's this aspect of, not only is it a unity of heavenly principle and then the earthly matter, but also it's the idea that each one of those things is in fact like a word, or a reality spoken by God. So it's that it becomes a sort of poetic relationship in a sense. So you wind up getting this. It's not just the one thing of this sort of interaction between, okay, there's abstraction of, you think like a bridge or something like that, like you can point to the math. It's like you can't really point to the math on a bridge. There's the heavenly aspect of a bridge, but there's not really like life there. Whereas you get sort of maybe a microcosm of what Matthieu talks about with the metaspace in a living creature or animal or something like that, where you have the heavenly aspect, the abstraction of the creature, and all the things that goes into its identity and everything like that. And then you have everything it's made out of. And then you have kind of like the personality of the dog or something like that. And so like that thing's participation in reality and its relationship to its creator is kind of something closer to an analogy of the metaspace thing. I mean, like it's very high up, but it's also something that's more easily participated in when you just kind of you have like a description of somebody, and then you have, or like the idea of someone, and then you like physically interact with that person, then you actually get to know them. Like there's the kind of like the super version of, or the super relationship, as opposed to like a parasocial, like, oh, I've seen this person talk before and like I know that they're made of carbon type of thing.
Made of carbon. Okay, great. Okay. I was not
I
prepared
think
for that
also,
one. Go ahead.
I was thinking in this, there's also one of the things is there's like a contrast in how the Daniel's friends here, how they participate in things and the way Nebuchadnezzar participates, because he's given this vision of the statue, and then he participates with that, what he's been given, by making everything into the gold. He's in what you would say like complete having mode, as opposed to the and the way he interacts with things, he's he's trying to have this high status position, whereas Daniel's friends, they're being in right relationship, kind of incorrectly participating, and because of that, they're able to like host the Son of God, and Nebuchadnezzar is eventually, driven mad and eating grass later.
Yeah. So to your point,
So,
there's actually an important bit in the actual book of Daniel where the companions are being rounded up to be sent into the furnace, and they're being threatened with the furnace that they should kneel before the statue and worship it. And they said, "Look, God will deliver us, and even if He decides not to, we're fine with that because we're not going to do this." And like that is definitely the right relationship thing, where it's like, okay, I know that He can do this, but also like whatever His will is, like that's still better than doing whatever kind of nonsense that you're trying to get me to do. So that is the complete being. Like they're not even seizing their own existence by law, whereas He's trying to take everything for Himself.
Yeah, so I'm gonna respond a little bit because I don't know how much has been covered, but this idea of the meta space, I like this idea that we're not anthropomorphizing God, right? We're theomorphizing ourselves, right? So we're presupposing, well, the fact that the hand can do hand things presupposes that there's something hand-like that can be done, right? And there's only a subset of that our hands can do, right? Like we're only a limited manifestation of what a hand can do. And then the question is, well, what is handness participating in? That it is a hand, right? And I think that's the meta space, right? That Pageau is talking about. So you're reaching for the original purpose, right? like because that your hand is serving a purpose for your body, right? And that purpose has a pre-existence in some manner, and and in that pre-existence, it has to be larger than just the purpose of your hand, right? So your hand cannot fulfill the complete purpose, right? So you get the same issue with the incarnation, right? So like God the Father is bigger than Jesus, right? The Word is bigger than Jesus, but still it finds expression in Jesus in a complete manner, right? In within the limitations of humanness. Um, yes. So I'll give some response there. Response time.
I think in a sort of anthropomorphic analogy that I could kind of give, like we're when we try to perform a task, a lot of times, like we're to your point, kind of we're bound by the limitations or constraints that we have physically. So there's if you're trying to do something, like say if you're trying to prop open a door or something like that, as an example, you could use your entire body and stand there and hold the door. Or you could use your arm to hold the door, or you could use your hand to hold the door, or you could use one finger pressed against the door to keep it open, or something like that. And so, depending on how you're expressing that and how fine of a point you want to put on it, you can perform a similar action at different scales, using more or less of yourself.
and yeah, that's the thing that comes up in the next few chapters of the book, is that the goodness of the thing is how well its manifestation conforms to its idea. So the handness of the hand is good in how well it hands, and the holding open of the door is good in, how it conforms to the telos of the action.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you're holding open the door to let in like a bank robber or something like that, and it's normally a locked door, like that's kind of, you can still be operating, like you could be using more or less of yourself in a bad telos. So that's that's more of that sort of thing that Father Eric usually talks about, where there's not really necessarily like a moral implication for the action itself unless you have a little bit more information. You know, like the putting a sharp implement into somebody is not really a problem if you're a surgeon doing surgeon things during work hours. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just try to like catch up. You guys are quicker on your feet than me. Well, Castle, first of all, your opening summary, I thought it was great.
Thank you.
Something that stuck out was your description of if you don't worship Nebuchadnezzar in the golden form, then the subjects are exposed to extreme space. So I've this whole time kind of been imagining like what it is to worship Nebuchadnezzar in the golden form. And I've been sort of imagining that like obsession. And then to be exposed to extreme space, I was imagining as like the things that you do in order to support obsession. So at the scale of like a civilization, it could be, subjecting the civilization to taxing them, making them work, whatever, trade, right? In order to, at the level of the individual, it's, arranging your life in a way, right, where you prioritize your obsession, etc. And that's the side where you're in max efficiency mode. And so you're probably violating Jordan Peterson's stop and pet a cat when you see one rule. So there's something aesthetic that you're cut off from when you're, in the space of the extreme space. And on the note of constraint, like when I read the story, like Nebuchadnezzar, for example, he just comes off as like being like a big baby. Like the president of the United States couldn't speak to people the way that he does. Like, hey, I had a bad dream. Interpret this, or I'll tear your house into dung heap piles. Like, no one. It's hard for us to imagine that type of thing in the world that we live in. Like we're used to powerful people, not having to use threats because they're not weak or insecure. And this kind of led me to this the second thing, like Manuel mentioned, we aren't anthropomorphizing God, we're theomorphizing ourselves. And so like when if it isn't obvious why more or less liberty is better or worse, and it's wise to accept the right constraint as a starting point. Like some people maybe should stay away from casinos, right? So I'm imagining this empire of Nebuchadnezzar and what it's like to be under him, a guy like this, or Nero. He sounds like one of these crazy, insane people who are obsessed. By the way, I mean the same thing like Hitler. A lot of these people had addictions and various obsessions, and so I'm just I'm kind of I'm just I don't know. Those were just sort of the boxes I was imagining the story in. We could go a lot of different directions from here, but I don't know. I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I want to respond in some ways. So I don't know how much we've gone over this already, but what stood out to me is 6T and 6, right? And so those are also the numbers of the beast, right? Only he has 600 with it. And I just realized like what is 60 but 6 on a different level of analysis, right? It's just lifted up by the 0 in some sense. So um, so I'll have to check into the numerical significance of 60, but you can imagine that 60 is basically could be talking about the level of nature instead of the level of human existence, for example. And then if you only impose one level, then you get one level of problem. If you impose two levels, then you can get way bigger problems. So 6 and 60 are related to breadth and height, where height is the bigger one. So the bigger height is also implying a tower, right? In my mind, it's referencing Babel with a lack of a sufficient base to sustain the height that is erected. Um, yeah, if someone wants to respond, they should just shout because else I'll just keep going. Um,
Well, that
Next.
move, that idea. I mean, the end of the chapter talks about the realization that space can never fully integrate time, created a higher space. And so, as Castle was explaining the Nebuchadnezzar kind of story, and he was, saying, well, then the people are exposed to extreme space. I've been thinking about, exactly what this. We can't keep doing that forever. You can't just keep pointing up to a more powerful person. At some point, we have to point to an ideal. And so I'm just sort of I've just been watching out for that in the book here. I don't have any insight on it, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually think that Nebuchadnezzar is a good faith person, and he is aspiring to reach the divine, but he doesn't have the means, right? Like he has nothing to rely upon, and then he has to go there himself. Like that's the way I see it, right? And then if you have to go there yourself, um, yeah, you have to throw away the things on the outside, right? Like if and not necessarily, right? Because like in some sense he would have been okay with them acting things out instead of actually living them out. Because he only needs the adherence, like any tyranny, right? Like they don't need the people to truly believe whatever they're selling. They just need them to comply. And so when the non-compliance happens, right? Then yeah, like you're gonna have to do something with that. Like you can't let it exist because it messes with your authority and with what you're representing, right? And like if you let them do that, then yeah, things will go bad, right? Because you can't sustain the thing you've built, right? And that's where you get the ultimate space. And I think Elena objected to this, like I don't know, like already like 7 book clubs ago or something, where it's like yeah, like that is a problem, right? And it's not resolved easily because like sometimes you have to you have to like set that boundary, and other times you have to have mercy. And how do you do that? Well, I don't know, right? And then what is the way that the boundary is set, right? Like it's the fiery furnace, which is, in my perspective, a man level made representation of hell. Um, so it's also fire, right? So burning of the dead wood, like all the same principles apply. So like from my perspective, Nebuchadnezzar is in the right pattern, right? He's just not in right relationship to the pattern. Um, you know,
And I'm thinking a lot of kind of, just like a workplace analogy, something like that. So you have like a tyrannical boss that is trying to manage by force or forcefully integrate his workers without actually like leading or something like that. And so, it becomes this sort of aspect of, you think of like, oh, when everyone hears the sound of the horn, you have to kneel. We kind of talked a little bit about like the human voice being kind of like the horn of the human being. So it's like you have this abusive boss that yells at people to try to get them to do stuff. So it's like at the sound of the horn, you kneel, and if you refuse to do that, in the workplace, you get fired, right? Like that's kind of, and so there is this kind of interesting aspect of, but also remembering that if you are properly aligned to the highest principle and thinking of like the Beatitudes here, this aspect of, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And so there is that aspect kind of happening here with the three companions where they're willing to lose their life for the sake of upholding righteousness to God. And then they find their life and they actually find a higher version of their life. And then even when they get returned back, they have positions of heightened authority within the Babylonian government when they come back. So there is that sort of aspect. And it's something that kind of like on the personal scale I've experienced before. I only got fired from one job once, and it was because I stopped lying for a call center thing because they told us to lie to the callers. And I did it for a while and it felt horrible. And I finally gave in and stopped doing it. And they caught on within a week and got rid of me. And I thought, And then I was unemployed for like 6 months, and I spent every last dollar until I got a new gig. And it was like actually when I spent my last dollar that I got a better place to work at, and I'm still there. But also, like I experienced the fiery furnace, and then also had to kind of wait through that for the longest time. And it's like that's something that when we talked about these things happening at multiple scales all the time, like it is something that people can experience in their own life, even in like 1 day or 6 month intervals.
Yeah, Castle, I think you misread. It is firing furnace, not fiery furnace.
And what's funny is that as a result of all of these things that Nebuchadnezzar is doing, like to Christopher's point, he gets at least temporarily fired from his job, and then becomes like a goat in the field for like a couple of months or something like that, until he is brought back to his senses. But there is this kind of aspect of like, you've been demoted for now, king, because you can't properly lead. Like you're not connected to the highest person. Because even after all the nonsense with this, he still screws up again. Like he doesn't learn his lesson until after he becomes like a goat in the field for a while eating grass. He finally gets it though, but it took a while.
Okay, I got severely distracted because there's this guy who tried to live like a goat for a while.
Oh, nice.
Right? Like, wait, like I guess the patterns are real.
Yeah, there's no escaping it.
But yeah, I should read the actual little biblical account, because I'm gonna go by what I read on this page, not by what I see, and what I see by this page, right? Is so we get to the second part of the dream, right, or what the response, right? So the tree refused to bow, right? So that's not heeding the call, and then Mr. 666 is heating the furnace 7 times. So that's interesting, right? So he's heating the furnace to a level of purification, right? A level of renewal, basically to get them to forcefully cohere. I don't know if Matthieu goes into that, but I'll just say it in right. So they, I think the flames are supposed to make them be renewed in his image, right? In his spirit. That's the purpose of the flames. And then seeing the fourth man, like I don't know how that makes sense in the context of the story, right? But it is interesting that he's the one that sees it, right? He's the one that makes the proclamation, and he's the one who makes the conclusion from it.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one who upholds the new order as well, right? And that's why I say, like, he isn't like the Pharaoh. He doesn't harden his heart, right? He is a true seeker in that sense, but he doesn't have the way, right? And in recognizing that there's an authority that supersedes his, right? In other words, his renewal doesn't work, and some other manifestation comes to me, right? To him, the Son of God, right, appears to him in uh, in that fire, right? And so, like, now he has something that's above him, right? Because I am fairly certain that he considered himself Son of God. Uh, so in some sense, he's conveying that title, right? He's relinquishing that to the proper authority, and in that, he's redeeming the nation as well, right? Like that statue gets toppled, right? And it doesn't topple in a way that it topples Nebuchadnezzar, right? Like he still gets maintained, at least at this part, as the head of the nation. Just now he's not on top.
Yeah. And yeah, I think, and this was a quick point that I mentioned when you ran away briefly, was that Saint Irenaeus asserts that the Son of God that Nebuchadnezzar recognizes here is the actual Son of God that he sees. And so every time Nebuchadnezzar gets, like, he puts his foot in his mouth for something, like, he does submit. He is quick, to your point of submitting to the higher authority, even when it's incorrect. So, like, when he sends Daniel to the lion's den, like, he prays that Daniel doesn't die in that situation, but he submits to the contract that he signed. So it's just like there's something hanging over Nebuchadnezzar's head, like, kind of the whole time, and it's not necessarily always the same thing, but he's submissive to the heavenly, even if it's like lower heavenly. And then his discernment is bad. But I think even in the book of Daniel, isn't there or like the hand of God writes on the wall? So, like, Nebuchadnezzar literally sees the writing on the wall.
That is Nebuchadnezzar's son actually is the one who sees the hand on the wall.
Okay.
And it's because that's the interesting pattern. Nebuchadnezzar exhibits a lot of what, like being in having mode, like I'm grasping at this thing, and that seems to be like the pattern that his son emulates there, and is the one where the kingdom falls at that point. So
the message that's written says, "You have been judged and your days are numbered," something like that.
So it's interesting, right? Because the writing on the wall is also some sort of footprint, right? So you can see yourself, like there's like the wall is something also that obstructs, right? You run into, and so that wall announces itself in a manner as well, right? Because you can recognize the wall before you hit it, and hopefully redeem yourself. But I think one point is important to make in relation to Nebuchadnezzar, right? So he's true, right? He just doesn't know what he's true to, right? And that's one situation. And the Pharaoh is a different situation, right? Like the Pharaoh is self-referential, like he's on top, and so he remains true to himself. And I think when you're dealing with a Pharaoh, the game changes, right? Like the way that things roll out changes compared to when there's actually an authority that's willing to recognize a higher authority. To go back to the Korean thing that I'm watching, the bowing down, right, of the king to another king creates a new dynamic, right, and that doesn't have to result in the end of the people, right? Only if you define the people in a specific manner and you can't maintain that definition, for example, that the king is the highest and there's nothing above the king, right? And like if you're reliant on that and then something gets above the king, then you're screwed, because like now you're no longer functional in all your presumptions about the world, right? Like when Peterson says, well, like, where did you make your mistake? Well, that's a pretty big mistake if the highest is not the highest, right? So yeah, and no, I do think that he's seeing Christ there, right? Like I think that is correct, right? Because like that's the authority that he accepts.
And I don't know, it's a silly image, but just kind of thinking that thing of, like, the sheep hear his voice, and then there's that kind of aspect where he's stuck living like a sheep because he was trying not to live like a sheep for a very long time. But the sort of aspect of the leadership, like a disconnect right at the leadership level where they're not connected to the highest, but you have everything else where, like, the structure is working more or less pretty much fine everywhere else, but you just have that last little disconnect. And I had this interesting and very disturbing kind of thing that at a meeting that I was at, there was a guest speaker for a charitable organization that was more or less spent their entire time giving their speech complaining about how things hadn't been going very well. And the organization had been founded by a person at a church. It was an elderly woman who opened her very large home to expectant mothers and young mothers. to provide pre and postnatal care for them. And then she wanted to go professional, but she was very elderly and she passed away before it happened. So people took up the mantle and did that. And so they actually bought an old convent which no longer had any nuns in it, and they set up shop in there and decided to do business. And they did very well for a while. And then, like many places in my area, actually, they dropped even though the diocese is still technically their landlords for the location, because it's still an old convent which is owned by the diocese, they dropped any Christian connotation whatsoever. And then within a matter of a couple of years, they're talking about how they just lost $250,000 worth of yearly income. And I asked, they were talking about finances the entire time, and I asked just the simple question, is there, with the fact that this was founded as a religious institution, like, how is that being kind of perpetuated? Like, is there, not just like, oh, are you having prayer times with these people or anything like that, but like, how is the kind of, not just the branding, but how is like the identity of this kind of conforming to that? And they said, oh, yeah, well, we don't discriminate. It's like, well, you're discriminating against the founder, so there's there's literally the entire intention, and they're not doing well, and unfortunately, after I said that, like, the interest in the thing from the other people in the meeting kind of dropped a lot. But it's unfortunate, to just see that little difference. Everything else, they're actually doing better, which is interesting. On paper, they should be way more successful than they were. And that's the only thing that changed. And they're doing much worse.
Yeah, that is interesting, right? And that asks for the standard of better, right? And to put that back to the frame of being connected to the highest, you can optimize better the lower you aim. Like, that's what aiming lower is, right? Like, I can optimize me getting out of the door, right? But maybe I'm exhausted and I can't go to where I need to go because I optimized getting out of the door, right? So that integration is important, and I wanted to reframe this in the understanding of boundaries, right? Because that's basically what the time thing is dealing with in some sense. It's like, okay, like you erect this structure, and this structure ossifies, and then there's boundaries, and like, how do you navigate those boundaries, right? And you have the idea of a membrane, right, which has, especially the cell, right? Like, the cell has a boundary that has certain capacities to, like, introduce water to the cell, remove water from the cell, remove salts, all of these things, nutrients as well. And so, like, what is this membrane doing? Well, it is a boundary that's mutating in its functionality, right? So it's adhering to something higher and proceeding to respond to the request of what the cell needs. And so they have a capacity, right? Because there's just constraints that the membrane has, and mediative capabilities, right? So speed of opening things, right? Like, when you open one thing, how much other things get in, all sorts of stuff like that, and all of these things, they they need to be managed in some sense, right? And so, like, what is the right relationship? Well, is that putting the furnace on and heating 7 times? Uh, now that I'm thinking about it, right? Like, that's what a fever is. Like, it's also heating the furnace to get out the bad parts so that the good parts go on, right? Um, So yeah, like, how do you mediate that, and what's the purpose of adhering to the highest principle, and maybe more importantly, that the highest principle is outside of the body, right? Because the cell also gets instructed from your body, so it's not uh, uh, an individual entity because it's part of an ecosystem, right? And the ecosystem will call it to do what it needs to do, and then it knows how to regulate things. And this is why, even though it wants water, for example, it can decide not to take up water or whatever because it needs to go somewhere else, like stuff like that. Um, I don't know if that's an actual biological mechanism, but I'm just going to presume it is. If it's not been invented, then it will be found.
Close enough. But yeah, I like the analogy of the fever as well, because you're burning out the impurities, but you're also not trying to burn absolutely everything. So like a lot of times it's even recommended to fast if you also have a fever or something like that. So there is that kind of increasing space and creating like sort of dry land in a sense, to just allow everything to go into repair mode, but also you're not trying to completely eliminate all bacteria from the face of the earth. Like you shouldn't be then not only fasting and undergoing the fever, but then also like bathing in hand sanitizer or something like that. Like you can go too far really quick, and then you can create a whole lot of other issues. And like that's something I experienced myself in my teens. I was prescribed enormous amounts of antibiotics at one point, and then what do you know? Your gut microbiome gets completely wiped out, and it takes a decade and a half to fix. And it's like that type of thing is a good example of that. There's a necessity for keeping some sort of remainder because they still serve a purpose. Like you're always going to have the poor with you. You need to have somebody at the bottom, and it's not always static either. Like you think about this economically, like the people that are in the top 1% are usually so for 1 year and that's it ever. That's usually the case. Almost no one actually stays in the 1% longer than that. Almost no one stays in the bottom 1% longer than a year either. That's usually how it goes. So there is that aspect of it. It's not 100% static, and a lot of these things are kind of changing. The thing that your body is fighting right now might actually be something that is, or the thing that your body has too much of, like white blood cells or something like that, might actually be really important for the next thing that you have. So you don't want to completely upset that balance permanently.
Okay, want to go to the next page?
I think we did the whole chapter, didn't we?
Oh no, I'm not even close to doing the whole.
Oh my gosh, that's everything I had. All right.
Oh man.
No.
All right, we'll see where it goes.
So at the top, last line, it says all parts would conform to the head. So that's an interesting word, conformation, right? So it's the interaction between conformation and embeddedness, right? So like you're embedded in your environment, right? Like let's say you're a farmer, and you need to do certain things to maintain that embeddedness so that you can sustain yourself, right? And if you get drafted, for example, you can no longer fulfill that function, right? And you can see, well, okay, like the village also has that function, right? So they can replace you to a certain extent, but at a certain point, the village can no longer be the village, right? And like if you draft too many people, you get a famine, right? So there's an interaction with the embeddedness, or you could, in different ways, you could say the necessities of life and the demands that the ideal can place upon you to conform, right? And in some sense, I think the conclusion from this is that that should not be mediated by humans, at least in that manner. So next thing that stood out to me is that it also points to the 6 directions of space and the sides of a cube. I was like, oh, because what do you have? You have a circle, but you also have a sphere, right? And you have a square, but you also have a cube. And I don't know, like that did a lot for me to have the the two-dimensionality extended to a three-dimensional space, and the numeric corollary with that, right? Because a circle and a sphere are kind of the same thing, but a square and a cube not really, right? Like there's a discontinuity in the cube in some sense that isn't there in the sphere.
I kind of see that a bit, where you were talking about like kind of the triplicate of these numbers, like 6 or 7. And I'm kind of thinking about that with respect to the nonlinear scaling. So you have this kind of, you've got the 1 time, so you've got, just like the single line, and then you've got the 2 times, you got now the 2 axes, and then now you've got the triple, now you have the 3-dimensional object, and I'm thinking kind of this with, I think it was like Kubal Kane or someone says, I've been avenged 77 times 7 times or something. So it's like, I have complete 3-dimensional, avenging happening that's just happened there. It's like it's very spherical.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you can see 7 as the remainder of a circle, which Matthieu described, but also like if you put 7 in relation to a cube, it's like there's no way to fit 7 in that, right? Like that's just like not gonna happen. Like, so it's interesting. Yeah, that like it has to be a tail, right? Like now, and in some sense it's an offense, right? Because like the cube is the cube, and it has a complete capturing of the space, right? Like it's accounting for everything, all directions. And then something else, right? So like now your space isn't the space because like it doesn't fit anything. So yeah, from that sense, it makes sense. I don't know if I can envision what's it called, a transgression, or, no, transference from state, or like a mutation from a sphere to a cube. Because like what would have to happen to make that happen naturally or whatever, right? Like that, it seems to be an unnatural movement. Let's just say it that way. And yeah, like there's a gap there in some sense, right? Like it's connecting to the leap of faith, right? Like you need to make a jump to somewhere else in order for it to be even for you to even be able to partake in it. And if you never make the jump, you're gonna be stuck in the space that you've set out.
Like in nature as well, like it's really rare to find like perfect 90-degree angles, but it's also extremely rare, if not completely impossible, to find like perfect spheres as well. So you kind of run into that issue where it's like there is sort of a mediation that's needed, and it's not something that is like it's going to be unnatural, something about that. And that if you're going from sphere to square, like there's a chopping off that kind of needs to happen. But then with the cube aspect, I think of just kind of like if you had like a cube and you just covered it with like Play-Doh or something like that to turn it into a sphere, like you wind up losing the identity more or less of cube. Like all of the parts are in there, but it's now integrated and covered in such a way that it's not recognizable anymore.
Well, yeah, like I think that's a good way to see it, right? Like so, to use Carl Jung's thing, right? We grow bigger then, right? So like, what's the mediation between cube and sphere? It's like, okay, like the sphere extends around the cube, right? And then you need a new cube that extends beyond the sphere, right? And like you're just gonna have to stay in that pattern, right? And now you got your fractal as well, right? Like that's just that dance.
You mentioned the cube being all encompassing. I Googled just now if all the gold in the world were in a cube, how big would it be? There's a quote attributed to Warren Buffett that says 68 feet or about 25 meters. So, which is kind of interesting because this is actually quite close, the number in here. But the idea is I mean, I was just envisioning all the wealth in the world, effectively, right? As that was the image that came to mind with when you mentioned six is the establishment of rationality, and then whether the six, one order up is, I mean, in this case, I'm envisioning it as a global image, like, an attempt to account for the entire globe, all of the wealth on the globe.
Well, you see it actually between Kamala Harris and Trump, right? So like Trump is using language that defines things, it cuts off things, right? And Kamala Harris is using the woolly language of like we're gonna lift things up, hope, like all of these things that are not defined. And and people are resonating with either message based on on how they're attuned, right? So there is a sense of hope in what Kamala says, right? At least in what the words uh, describe. um, I would argue that's not connected to reality, right? And like what is reality? Well, reality is like the cube, like it's like that which is possible, like the space that's delineated in which we live right now, right? And so you could say that the progressive impulse is imagining a bigger sphere, right? So that sphere can erect a bigger cube, right? But then the question is, well, like, what is the means that you get to a sphere? Because if that's your sphere, you're gonna end up making the transgression of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Like you're gonna make a golden head.
I think of there's that thing. I don't know if it's in Revelation or where, but it's but like all of the leaders of the nations gathering together to give their glory to to the heavenly kingdom. And so this aspect of like they still they get to keep they're still identifiable as their own nations that are kind of subsumed under this higher kingdom. But it's because of their kind of submission to the completeness that they're able to retain their cubeness in a sense. And I'm thinking of Danny's great point about just like this cube of gold, and that being just kind of like the sum of the Earth's wealth being just like a few dozen meters or something like that. Whereas so many people will go and um, they frame everything in an economic lens. The economy is this, and we have to do all this stuff. And I remember seeing it was this ridiculous meme where it's like a picture of like the Earth exploding, and it's like, oh, this will have an impact on the economy, I think. It's just like such a useless frame. But also, like, if you're properly attuned, like, there's room for currency. Like, you can still have trade and all these things if you're properly aligned. But it really does, like we were talking about before. If you're not connected to a proper telos, then it does wind up shrinking. Like you essentially just have just like a 68-meter cube, that's just kind of sitting there. And it's like, what can I actually do with this?
Yeah, I think if there's the pattern of the like the tree or mountain for space here, you need the base to be bigger than the summit for the thing to be stable. But you can't just like expand the base. You can't just expand the base and expect that the height will increase because you expanded the base, and you can't just increase the height while using the base to increase the height while shrinking the base, because either way it just falls over.
Yeah, so that actually reminds me to a conversation I was having this week. So there was this guy, and he basically was relying on science, like the usual pattern. And yeah, like Christopher says, it's like, what is science doing? It's like expanding the base. Like that's what it's doing. Like, okay, we can base our decision on all of these facts. It's like, fine, okay, great, right? But what do you do with the height, right? And like at a certain point, I just told him like well, I don't know how I said it, but basically I said, you're not there yet, right? Like I can see things, and you're just a child, right? Like that was the context of my message, right? And he called me out. He's like, you're condescending, right? And like I've had a lot of talks about condescension. It's like, And I'm like, okay, yes, I am. Like, what's wrong with me being condescending, right? Like, and then we got into this whole thing, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Like, what's happening? Like, why am I not allowed to be condescending? And like, I gave them examples, right? Like, if if you have any expert, right, is allowed to be condescending, anyone, even martial arts, was like, oh yeah, you don't know that yet because you're not at that level. And I'm talking about spiritual development, and I'm not allowed to see myself as superior and to treat others from a superior position. And I was called out by a Christian for making that move as well. I was like, what's going on here, right? And it's like, well, how do you get to to raise the top, right, from that broad base? Because if no one is allowed to say that they're higher up, and they're not allowed to act from there, you can't get up. Like that's the consequence. Like up doesn't exist anymore because we cut off the head.
You kind of get that thing with like the crabs trying to crawl out of a bucket sort of thing, and the one trying to crawl out just gets dragged back in.
Yes.
But at the same time, there's also, I mean, assuming Plato is correct, I never read that book. The about that aspect of, okay, like the philosopher needs to be brought down to the city and has to essentially get ridiculed for by trying to teach people. Like it's also there is that aspect of you're not going to be appreciated. Like it was I forgot who it was that said it, but there was someone that was kind of speaking on like encouraging people to go out and do like charitable mission and stuff, like actually go out to like poor countries and these sorts of things. And somebody asked them, oh, you've been at this for so long and you're so good at it, what are some tips for dealing with the poor? And he was like, yeah, they're ungrateful and they smell bad. And it's just, and it wasn't a thing of like, oh, I'm gonna kick them while they're down. It's just be ready. Like when you're going to be doing the service, like no, you're also not, like, you better not be doing it for appreciation because it's not going to happen, and if it does, like, just be very grateful that it happened because it's not
No, 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 no. Then you need to get suspicious. Like that's
right. Yeah, so maybe they're trying to slay you from.
that's why all the glory has to go to God, right? Because like
Yeah.
if you end up a lower level, you end up like moving things, right? You end up moving incentives, you end up moving dynamics, and then you end up moving the identity of that what is manifested.
And you get a target on your back. So there's that aspect of like storing up treasure in heaven so that no one can steal it. And it's just like, yeah, if you win the lottery right now, how many people are going to come swarming after you? You find the love of your life, and also like a whole bunch of people want to kill you. It's just like all within the same week. Wow. It's just like, but I want to answer Elena's question here. She says that it's too loud where she is, but yeah, the number 7 is also related to kind of a circle. So in order to do a circle, but we had a previous diagram of this of if you try to do a circle by its diameter, you need to have like an irrational number. So there is that kind of aspect of to do the rest in relation to like the rest day. To do the rest, there's some irrationality at that last bit. And so like the 90-degree angles and so forth for the cube would be very much in the manner of work and reason and rationality, which are associated with the number 6, and with humanity as kind of rational mediators at high cost. Whereas the spherical is related to 7 in the sense that you may have the well-defined cube, but then with the sphere you get the rest of the picture in a sense.
So the sphere, the circumference of the sphere is 2 pi times, it's the radiant, well, from the center to the side, right? And 2 pi is 3.147, whatever, like
Pi
a
is
whole bunch.
3.14159,
There
etc.
we go. I knew it up to 10 digits, but not anymore. And So you have that number, and I think it's you get to it as 1 divided by 1 plus 1 divided by 3 plus 1 divided by 5, and you just add all of them, and then you get to pi. Anyway, um, the point is that so the pi is like 6 plus a little bit, right? And that little bit is then the tail, right? And so that's connected to the Sabbath according to Matthieu in that sense. And so if you go to a sphere, you have pi squared, I think, times radius squared or something,
I
times.
think it's like pi radius squared, something like that.
Yeah. Well, at least like the pi is, I think, in under the square, right? But um, you because you now have to, and then you get the surface of, so you don't get the circumference, but you get the surface area of the sphere. But I think more importantly is using radians, right? So if you have the center, you can use a radial system to describe all the locations on the sphere, right? And so you use distance 1 because that's the default distance, but you can use a different distance as well. And then you can say the angle in well, the x-axis on the thing, and then the angle in the y-axis and the angle in the z. Is that true? Like, is it 3 angles or 2?
I don't do math.
Okay. Probably 3 angles, and these 3 angles also allow you to describe the whole sphere, right? And so instead of a surface, now you have a vector, right? You describe the vector space of the sphere, and like, well, anyway, and then you don't have to use pi, and some people really like that, but you get into a whole different type of math
See, it sounds like a whole lot of work.
It sounds like a whole lot of work, but I think that's also the transition to Einsteinian relativity, because I think Einsteinian relativity uses vectors instead of a grid, right? So you get just if you use that approach to the world, you also change what you see in some sense, and the relationships that you can describe, and so like that's why people think math is amazing, because like math allows you to give different descriptions. um, and now I had a weird math flex, which is not fresh in my memory, so if I made mistakes, please correct me. So I wanted to go to the center of the page, back to the fiery furnace, right? So he's trying to contrast the sound of music with change. I use the word reorientation there, and then the means is the fiery furnace if the voluntary nature is not there. I found the piece below that a really unfortunate description. I don't know if anybody else struggled with that, but like I have a smiley face with a frown. So in my notes, I can show.
Ooh, yeah. What specifically was your apprehension?
Yeah, like I don't think it's an attempt to forcefully resist the flow of change.
Mm.
Right? I agree that that's happening, right? But this might be mistaken the action for the intent or the consequence for the intention, right? Like I don't think that was the intention, right? Like it's just like it's a set of constraints that follows an adoption of a certain type of relationship.
Well, so the whole reason why he started doing it was because of fear after the dream. But then, like, is that, I don't know. Like most of what's happening is probably not that, but that was kind of like the spark that set it off.
Yeah, but like we all have this, right? Like we refuse to change in some level, right? I was like, well, yeah, like why do we do that? Out of fear. Like fair enough, right? But sometimes that fear is justified. Like sometimes we shouldn't change, right? So again, this goes back to the loaded language, right? Like why are like I get there's loaded language because like the example is loaded, right? But yeah, I don't know. Like I don't it doesn't sit well with me.
Well, I think kind of Nebuchadnezzar is kind of rebelling against time, because that's the way the statue in his dream is like, starts with the gold and then over time degrades into the lower levels of that. That's happening over time. And he's wanting to like not submit to the time or whatever. He doesn't want to integrate time. And so he does, like the book says, this extreme space thing where everything has to be integrated right now.
That's an interesting
But
point.
it takes
I hadn't. Oh, sorry, please.
but well, I was just gonna say, but it takes time to integrate things. And so like that's why
Well,
kind of why it falls apart.
yeah, you can describe it that way, right? Like I would describe it in the sense that he's trying to perfect things, right? And if
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to perfect things, then you want to have the right framework, right? The framework that organizes everything, right? And that's where you get the having mode from, like you were saying, right? And then in that having mode, right? Like now you're narrowed on that which you're acting out. You have to exclude time, right? So I again I agree with the trying to cut out time, uh, but this is also what science is doing, right? Like it's trying to cut out
Mm-hmm.
the variables and what is time, right? Like time is literally defined as the introduction of variables by Matthieu, right? Like he's defining it as the modality for change.
Yeah, I had never thought, and I really like the point about the statue in the dream is a 4-dimensional statue, and he responds with the 3-dimensional statue.
Mm.
That, and I don't know. It's interesting. Like I knew that it was a representation of these other things, but I didn't stop to think that the feet are in the future. Like that's a really interesting point. I like that a lot.
And you want to say more about that? The feature in the future.
I'm still kind of processing it a little bit, but I'm thinking about it within that sort of that frame of the way that uh, the scientific pursuit is kind of trying to do this thing of, okay, we're going to present models of certain things, and like therefore this is how things always were, this is how things are going to be, or something like that, and they're restricting variables. I think of like, some of these like atmospheric models where it's just like, okay, if you've ever seen like particle rendering for even like an animated cartoon, and like just how much time it takes to render that, like you're not making models that are actually going to be anywhere near accurate. Like you're not gonna model dust in the air or something like that. So you do have to really mitigate these variables. And then the idea that this is also across time, completely impossible to wind up modeling that, but he's essentially doing that. So there's this thing of, okay, things are going a certain way, this is the pattern that's currently playing out, and its foundation, or its feet are in the future. So it's like you can't even address that per se right now. Like even the nation that is going to wind up infiltrating your place, like you can't even do anything about them right now. Like that's just not even an option. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to create something. I'm going to create a model of this pattern that I witnessed, and I'm going to put it right here, and everyone has to agree. Yeah, it's like, oh, that's a really interesting thing. I'm sure that'll make a huge difference. When you're eating grass in a field next year, it's just like there's, but it's but yeah, it's like, where have I seen that pattern outside of Nebuchadnezzar? I don't know. Maybe all over the place.
Um, So at the bottom of the page, Daniel's companions represent strangers, right? But strangers that are in adherence to a higher principle, right? So that's important, right? Like, so again, like these categories, like yes, fine, but uh, um, stranger's representation of time on a human scale, right? So what is that, right? Like you to go back to Jesus appearing to the guy on the path and he's shouting out to him. Uh, it's the introduction of something foreign, right? And that allowing for the transformation to happen, right? So going back to the idea of a Kairos moment. Uh, every time something gets foreign gets introduced, that is an opportunity for a fundamental change, uh, potentially. Not always a good thing, but
And these guys are kind of they're the stumbling stone as well. So
right.
they're kind of they come from a land where they themselves probably wouldn't have been all that significant maybe in their own land. If things had kind of gone where Babylon hadn't completely taken over, like they may not have actually had the opportunity to rise to this particular status that they have as very high ranking uh, officers in that government, and so they're this kind of foreign hierarchy kind of affords that, but not without a huge amount of like growing pains and extremely high risk.
Um, so let me go to the next page. So here, like at the top, it says, in order to heat the furnace 7 more times, it refers to subsuming the irrationality of time into the rationality of space. Like I don't know. Like I don't know if I'm in agreement with that frame.
To me, what came to mind with the 7 times more was like, if I mean, a campfire should be hot enough to burn someone, and so it's irrational, right? It's like a crime of passion or something like that to heat it. And that's you have the numerology from 7, but I mean, presumably a furnace was already hot enough to get the job done, right? So it's like it's going all in here emotionally.
Right, but he's also not doing it 9 times, right? Or 10. So um, there's an intentionality in the use of 7, right? So in that sense, I agree with Matthieu, but like I don't. Yeah, I guess he's just seeing it from the perspective of the stranger, right? And then the stranger not being allowed to maintain its identity, and therefore needing to subsume, right? So the thing that I just noticed was like, okay, so the stranger announces itself, right? Like they start making trouble. Because before that everything is normal, and then it's like the fool, right? They're pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, and the same with the stumbling stone, right? Like the stumbling stone is there, like you stumble over it, so it is already announced, and in the announcement it can no longer be denied. Um, and so maybe that's a better way to phrase this, right? It's trying to deny time its effect instead of subsuming it. Um,
Could it also be looked at as um, the heating it up 7 times is what makes it a fire of purification and renewal for the 3 men that go into it rather than destruction? That's why it needs to be 7. Whether that was intentional in there or not, does it matter?
no, I think you're right, and so like maybe it's inverting the directionality, right? So instead of the the outside changing the inside, it's the inside changing the outside. Um, and so basically, it's saying the outside doesn't have authority over the inside. Um, and then the fire is the renewal of the outside, or the purification of the outside so that it can fit inside.
I'm thinking of, and I do think you're right, Olena. I'm thinking of the walls of Jericho here as well. It seems like this is kind of, we're seeing if the actions that were taken by the Israelites going to enter into Jericho is happening from within outwards, in a sense. That it's this kind of encroachment outwards of, instead of, okay, you know, we're going to do the circles around and everything like that, and then we're going to shout and sound the horns, and then we're going to go in. It's, we're going to do this whole kind of song and dance and everything like that, but there's no dance, and we're going to go out, and everyone is going to do the thing. They're all, instead of we're going to break down the walls, everyone is going to be part of the wall, you know, and it doesn't work. Like there is that kind of element of trying to do this in reverse, produces kind of an unforeseen effect for them.
Well, I think you also have to recognize, right, to go back to the authority, right? So what did Israel do? Well, it brought its superior army to the walls, right? And so they were gonna win, right? Like they already were established as who they were, right? Which is the victors. It just hadn't manifest yet. And the situation here is different, right? Like Nebuchadnezzar is the victor, right? He's established order. Like who are these three guys? Like they're nobodies. And so having authority from a place of authority and having authority from a place without authority, which is the stranger, right? Like they by definition don't have any authority, right? Like that has a different pattern, I think. Yeah. Um. So yeah, I think here the mediation of boundaries is highlighted in this diagram as well, right? So you have the boundaries that are solid, and you have an ever-changing boundary of the music effectively there on the one side. That's what I had. We wanna go there? We're gonna jump to part 4. Like a big applause for ourselves.
We're probably not going to get through this chapter in 5.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Nice little
We'll
intro
make
to part
a
5.
stab at it because I am not prepared for this one. Who wants to take this one off?
Gosh.
Take the honors of
The honors.
of stepping into the furnace.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, now I got reminded of the surface analogy. So there's also a different purification that happens in furnaces, right? So if you put in clay into the furnace, you can make the clay as beautiful as you want, but it doesn't mean that it will survive the heating, right? So in the heating, there's also a testing. Like it shows that which is put into the furnace, like whether it's pure or not, because only a pure vessel can withstand the hardening, and that's also the other effect, right? So it takes the clay, which is soft and malleable and therefore like subject to time, to something that's no longer subject to time. Right? So it's also an agent of well, of burning of the dead wood, right? Like of removing everything that does not participate in the final order, right? In the final telos, because like, it, yeah.
It's interesting because with the kiln, like you do wind up, you get rid of impurities, but you also get rid of all the water. So there is that kind of like remainder kind of going up in steam, but then it is then at that point integrated, and then even further integrated. Like it not only is it has the integrity of the structure actually increased as a result of the heat and light applied to it? But now you can actually do something with it, like if it's a pot or a mug or something like that. Like it can now start serving a purpose. And so there is that kind of aspect of like that these people who are the companions that were put into the fire, actually they get jobs after this too. So there is that kind of aspect of like they're in the kiln and then now they're ready to serve their purpose within the community.
I think the same holds true for metal, right?
Yeah.
You need to heat metal to remove the impurities because you can't without
Yeah.
it.
So I'm gonna just mention. So it says God planted a garden eastward. So just want to kind of point out that when the fall happens, everybody moves west. But God, in a sense, like there's a lot of play on words that kind of comes up, but I think a lot of it is apt that he plants the garden the right way, in a sense, and then when people go, things start going the wrong way, they wind up going in the reverse direction, and you kind of see that same sort of movement happen with Jonah. So it's like, okay, I want you to go east to Nineveh, and then he goes west. It's just like, okay, and then he also winds up in the flood and down in darkness and everything like that. So there is a little bit of that kind of repeating of the right and left that we saw in previous chapters.
Oh, that's interesting because I saw different.
Really?
Yes, because what is in the east? That's which gets shown on first by the sun.
Yeah.
Right? So it's also representative of the early stage.
Mm.
Right? So if you proceed to the west, you also proceed in development of the seed in some sense, right? So if you say, well, God planted the Eden, so he's planting a seed in Eden, and the day, right, going from east to west is the unfolding of the seed, right, which is also through the fall, right? So there's a building of something, right, which ends up in Israel, I think, or whatever. Like I don't even know where you want to. But there's a journey that is started in the garden, and that has certain fruits, or like it ends up in getting planted in Israel, right? Like in the promised land. Um, and and maybe that's a new seed, or maybe the seed is still unfolding. I don't know how you want to look at that, but
I do agree. I think just where I'm kind of at is there was unfinished business in the East before the westward movement, something like that. And it's
I agree. Yeah.
I'm thinking also of Jonah there too, where he probably could have gone west after Nineveh too. Like he didn't. He had a job to do, and he just refused to do it. He could have actually saved himself a whole lot of trouble by just going and doing the job, and he could have gone west after.
Mm-hmm. So I agree with the unfinished business, right? But you maybe could also look at it as you need to be worthy to go to the east. So before you can go east, you need to go west first. That might also be something.
Yeah. So I had this interesting insight earlier today while driving, where I was thinking about sort of the fall of Nebuchadnezzar, and then that sort of being, even though his kingdom and everything like that falls apart, he does eventually wind up remedying his ways as a singular human being at the end of his story. And then I was thinking of this kind of aspect of there are consequences to pride and to the sort of Tower of Babel thing on the communal scale, but also this aspect of trying to attain to things too high above your station before they're given to you. And so that sort of taking of the fruit, or trying to attain to a higher state or status than is appropriate at the time, that it's necessary for you to actually, like, even in like eschatologically, like getting into the kingdom of God or something, but for you to be properly integrated, it's necessary for you to be humbled, or even like the word humble means like earth. So it's like it's necessary for you to go down into the earth first before you can kind of sprout up. Otherwise, you're kind of like in the parable of the sower, like the things on rocky ground where it sprouts up instantly, and then just shrivels away because there's no roots. Like it needs to go deep first, and you can probably save yourself a lot of trouble by there becoming worthy or entering in humility and letting yourself grow in proper time. Whereas if you spring up, then it's just like, okay, yes, I will ascend, and then it's just like, oh, you just shriveled up because you don't have roots.
Yeah, I like this idea, right? Like going to the west as setting roots, because I also think going to the west is associated with wandering, right? Like covering a lot of ground, right? Like so there's an expansion, while the garden is a centralization in the oneness, right? Like in the one place. And well, to continue with what's written in the book, right? The ultimate purpose of the garden is to receive the full knowledge of God within creation. I don't know about that, but actually, since recent developments, that seems to be more in line with my thinking. So, but yeah, like that's a big statement, right? Like, there's this place. There's the place you get exiled from, and then there's a movement away from it and towards it, and in some sense, right? Like, who is it? The Babylonians, right? They come from the east, right? They come from the east to destroy the temple, blah blah blah, and they take Israel back east, which is interesting, right? But they're not interesting, but they're not taken by their own means, right? they're taken by this other authority, which is doing the will of God, even though it's wrecking them.
Yeah, I do like the aspect of the garden being a place to receive the full knowledge of God. Just within the context of what I mentioned earlier on in this episode of the like the Franciscan sacramental worldview, is this kind of aspect of getting to know God through His creation and getting these kind of ideas of like, oh well, getting to know the artist by his art, that type of thing. And so if the garden is a microcosm of creation, then perhaps you're getting a very condensed version. Maybe because there's not as much manifestation, you can't get as many specifics, but at least you have a very condensed version of the artist's works, and then you can kind of get to know him through the things that he made.
Well, so I was thinking about what the trees meant, right? Because all the trees in the garden were planted by God, and they reach up to heaven, and at the same time, there's this tree of the knowledge of good and evil that is off limits, right? So, like, what's a tree? Well, a tree is a pillar, right? Like, it's a connection of heaven and earth. Like, it's a mountain. It's all of these things, right? But it's a natural version of those, right? And so you get to eat from them. You get to partake from them, right? You get to eat the fruits, and like, to go back to my intention, right? Like the footprint. What is the fruits, right? Like, what is the fruits of the things planted by God? Well, the fruits of the things planted by God is, well, you get to taste the work of God. Like, I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, I was thinking about the fruitfulness. I talked to some college students the other week, and I was talking to them. We were talking about the of fruitfulness, and that being kind of like a joyful productivity or joyful use of the things that you are or that you have access to, and these sort of things. And more so, it's kind of like a joyful being that produces something. And there is that sort of aspect of that. It's like God in the creation has joyfully produced things and made use of things, and so there is that aspect of being able to partake and participate, and even just kind of that thing of like, even the way St. Paul talks about like giving thanks, and even in just kind of eating, like just absolutely anything of that kind of just like, hey, all of this stuff,
Savoring, right? That's the word.
Yeah.
Because eating isn't enough.
Right, yeah, yeah. You're not just inhaling the stuff or anything like that, but yeah, you're really enjoying the thing and saying like, hey, someone put effort into, someone fulfilled this, you know. Even if there was something that like you have the work of human hands or something like that, it's still being accomplished, and there's nothing that was made that wasn't made by him.
Oh, right. I want to bring this in for a second. I like this frame, right? Yes, yes, and or yeah, I don't know if authority is the right word, but they're bringers, so they're agents. Like yeah, I guess that's yeah. I don't know if chaos has authority, but there's they're bringers of chaos, right? And then the question is that chaos good or bad, right? Like or is it always good? But do we just have to find the way in which it is good, right? Like so it doesn't necessarily have good fruits, but like the fruits of encountering might be good, right? So then well, that's the meta move, right? You're taking a step bigger, um, and you're engaging with the higher frame, um, and I think that's what the redemption is, right? Like redemption is the higher frame subsuming the disturbance in a way that's still pointing towards the good. Elena, did you want to jump in? No?
I think you covered it well.
Okay, thanks. Um, so going down to the bottom of the page, uh, we have the cosmic prototypes, right? Or you could say uh, the godly categories, right? Like those that flow directly from God. And then you have the varieties on the human level. Um, so he's connecting the tree to space there. Um, I was, I think I was connecting it to a subset of space, but yeah. Um, and then the snake is for me the interesting thing because if we see time, and like I have to keep reminding myself this is Pageau time or Bible time, not time time. uh, this is the issue I had with chemistry as well. They use symbols for things, and it's like I can never remember what they're pointing to. Um, so yeah, the snake is more sensible to me, right? So in a way, it's like how is the snake acting within the story of Genesis 3? Well, the snake is acting as the introduction, right? Like to go back to this idea of the authority of the stranger. It's voicing the external voice, right? It's voicing the breaking of the frame. Um, it's voicing the other than that which is established. Um, so that's the introduction of a Kairos moment again, right? Like it's okay. Like now things have the possibility to change, or the change can get rejected and things can remain the same, right? And so if you respond to the change, right, when in alignment with God, you get the fall, right? Because now the change is turning you away from God. If you're turned away from God and, right, because this is a big and, the change is pointing you towards God, then that is a good change. And like uh, this idea that Jesus says that he needs to be held up like the snake Moses put up. Uh, so he's basically saying change needs to happen. like you need to listen or account for the snake, and in accounting for this snake, you are turned back towards God instead of uh, away from God. And and to go back to the story functionality, right? You have the idea of a psychopomp, like it's like something that makes spirits move in a certain direction, right? And so like I think that's what the snake is, right? Like the snake is making things move in a different direction, because it now gets put on top in relevance, at least locally. Uh,
I just wanted to mention, I really think it's entertaining the fact that he describes the garden and male and female and tree and snake as garden varieties. That's often like a term that's used for just kind of like, oh, these are like just the common sort of thing. I thought was a very, very clever touch that he had there.
yes.
I'm sorry, Christopher, were you going to say something?
No, I wasn't going to say anything. I was just agreeing with you. So
So we have sort of the prototypes and then the garden varieties there. And I just wanted to mention, so this is something he's kind of, in a sense, I think, dropping a breadcrumb for later. There is this kind of aspect of we've talked about like the self-similar fractals and how you
Fractals, I like it.
Yeah,
Like they hang on they're the tail fractals. Like
yeah, that might actually be my next title for next week. But this aspect of trees are self-similar structures. So like if you Google is a tree a self-similar structure, like you're not going to find anything. But if you just look at a tree, it's just like, okay, you've got the trunk and then you've got the branch and then it turns into a bunch of these other little twigs and then they all turn out into
look
these
up
other
programming
things.
trees. They're
Yeah.
even worse.
Yeah. And so you have that sort of aspect. And then there's this aspect of, and I think this is much later, but the idea of there's the two trees in a sense that are in the garden that are, you've got there's a whole bunch of different trees, but there's specifically the focus is put on the tree of life and then the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And the third aspect of this diagram on this page is very similar to the concept that's conveyed in a lot of the Christian tradition of that you have to, as we were kind of talking about, like you have to pass through the roots to get to the kind of to the rest, that that there's the sort of surrounding aspect and that they're more or less the same tree. And there is, in addition to the fact that trees are self-similar structures that have the kind of branching off and everything, that when there's multiple trees that can interconnect their roots, that they actually become like networks. So like trees can actually, a lot of trees are actually like seen to communicate and like more or less become like a community of trees. So you can kind of have that aspect if they're planted right, like super close to each other, you have more or less the same thing. So you can have kind of like a treed wall that you would have to pass through that's also fruit bearing that you would have to pass through to get into the center.
Yeah, Jonathan Pageau actually also has a video on this where another frame he uses is 3 different trees in the garden. The walled one is the fig tree, and then there's the tree of knowledge of good and evil that's kind of like in the middle of this mountain, and then at the very top is the tree of life. That's kind of, he has a video on that type of framing as well.
Yeah, something I've been observing as I've been reading this and thinking about this is like is that symbols aren't portable and can't just be dropped in. So for example, in the previous chapter we talked about how the strangers encountering a stranger is, you're encountering a new potential, and they can kind of perform the function of time. They can be encountering a stranger can be the cause of a transformative change. And in this part, the serpent also is in that same role. But the serpent, I think, is different than a stranger. Like if you try to drop in things like change the serpent to a stranger in the story doesn't work. And I think that's because of many reasons. But like previously, like the attributes of a serpent, if you remember previously when we were talking about light and dark, and you remember that we had those 4 colors. The serpent is low in the earth in the dark, right? And so if you imagine so when I think of the serpent, I was always thinking of the subliminal forces, the subtle influences, etc. And so it like when thinking about what these things mean, why I'm explaining this is because of this kind of mapping. When on this page here, cosmic prototypes, garden varieties. When I start to map things, and as we establish these thoughts, as I try to like kind of swap. Okay, in this story, this thing represented time and this influence. If I try to drop them into another story, oftentimes that doesn't work very well. And then that sort of causes me to think about the other attributes of why is it exactly that the stranger, because like in the previous story, the stranger's kind of neutral, right? But here, a
Mm-hmm.
serpent has some inherent connotations of being dangerous, or it's kind of, a serpent is not really. Well, I mean, maybe I guess. Okay, maybe that's wrong. Maybe there are serpents that don't bite, and you know. So I don't
No,
know. I don't
Jesus
know.
Jesus took the place of the serpent, right? Like he's displayed as a serpent. So and it's analogous to time, right? So in this sense, it's neutral, right? Because time is not good or bad, right? Like because you don't know.
But it's still dangerous. Finn's right,
It,
it's still dangerous.
yes, but also it's also saving, right? like
Yeah.
um, but like I want to point back at what you're saying because I think you're saying something really important, uh, and that's referencing back to the use of loaded terms, right? So like, uh, yeah, like maybe the snake is an unloaded term, right? Like maybe the snake is just neutral, or it's not the proper representation, right? Like no, like you said, like the snake, at least in the garden story, is subtle, right? Like he is, right? Because he's voicing the words of God with a little bit of change, right? He's not doing something completely alien. No, he's making a small change with big results, right? But still a small change, and um and so yeah, like I agree that it's fruitful to look at it that way, right? But also like the snake in the story is on the tree, right? So it moved from the ground, which is the natural position, right? And like what's the ground? But that's emergence, right? Like that's where things come from, right? And if something emerges up to your the level of your head, or I can think of Mowgli, right? Jungle Book, the Disney version, is even above, and he's doing the thing with his eyes, the hypnotizing, right? If you have the snake above you, right, like that's a whole different thing. But it matters whether the snake comes from below or from above, and what the relationship is with it. And like I found that idea really coming true in Pageau's latest video about the morning star, right? Where the morning star is like an office, right? So you have a symbolic category, and then it's occupied by something, right? So it can be occupied by the enemy, which is a way that we speak about the devil, at least in my church. And the enemy has an intention, right? Like it's the enemy is characterized by opposition, by rebellion. The thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy, right? So if the enemy occupies the office, then the way that the office gets expressed is one way. If that same office is occupied by Jesus or by Christ, then that unfolds a different manner, right? And so now the question is, uh, what are we talking about, right? Like when we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar, like is that an office? Is that someone representing an office? Is it both, right? And then you have to disambiguate. And I think that's what you're pointing at. Like because the snake is the category snake, but it's also in a role. And the category and the role are not the same thing.
Yeah, that was well put. I mean, that's exactly what I'm doing when I'm reading these stories. I'm trying to imagine the entire story in my life, right? I'm trying to see like, what is this? Where is this pattern, right? So,
And there's that sort of disconnect that's also happening. So you have, once that snake is at your level and you're looking straight, so you're no longer attending up, or the thing has managed to get its way above you, or you permitted it because you're the mediator and you let that happen. Not, oh, like the snake starts undercutting God, and you don't just say, okay, like go back to your house or whatever. It's just like we're not having this conversation. Um, and I just think of that again, of that organization I mentioned that I heard from before, where it's like there is something where they're attending to something lower that they've now placed as their highest guiding star, essentially, and which is more or less just money. And that they had done this when it was originally started as a religious Christian institution. And that as soon as they allowed the lower things to start creeping up, that's where the things started to fall apart. And I think about a lot of these cases of, you look at like saints who were homeless, that, I talk about these guys a lot, like a lot of saints were homeless and they founded 20 churches and built monasteries and all these things with essentially their bare hands and no money. And it's like, how were they able to do that aside from being properly oriented upwards? And then as soon as a bunch of accountants came in, not that accounting itself is bad, but the accountants became the highest authorities over these places, and then they go out of business within 5 years. And that's usually how, even if they were in business for 300 years before that or something like that, it happens quick as soon as you stop attending high.
I like that, like the idea of the accountant becoming the head. That's powerful, right? Like, and I think it's a little bit different than the advisor becoming the head, because there's a lot of fairy tales and stuff like that where the, well, Merlin, for example, right, becoming the head, and then and you could say, right, that's a perversion, because then the office is being ruled by someone who's not in the office, right? So that's not having skin in the game or something like that. Like, I think that's really important about, like, you actually need to be accountable for who you are. And like, I think that is the excuse for aristocracy or whatever. Like, no, like you need to have people be the being that they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And if you don't grow into the being you're supposed to be, then how are you gonna, like, hold the office properly?
Right.
Like I went to the wedding of my church yesterday, and I'm just there, and it's just alien to me, right? Like, they're not following the rules that seem obvious to me, right? And then the question is, well, like, can I take a lead there? No, like I can't. Like, it would be wrong of me to assert things. Like, I can assert things that I see that are obviously false, right? It's like, okay, like, now you're misguided. I can point at the misguidance, but I can't judge their guidance, because I don't have means. Like, I don't see the participation. Also, like, that means that I'm excluded, right? Like that means that the body should not accept me, at least completely, because I'm not there, right? Like, I'm not part of the body in the same manner as the body part. Now, everybody has these limitations, obviously, but it's it's interesting to see that, and to live it. Um, and like, on the way back, I had this story about this guy trying to integrate in the Netherlands, and yeah, like, how, when you come in, like, you don't have the framing that they use here. Like, you don't you're just missing fundamental relationships, assumptions, and you're gonna run into a wall, because like that wall is just gonna show itself to you at a certain point.
it's so interesting how our like the things that we experienced this last week are so similar, even though they're completely different. Because I had the sort of similar thing of that the amount that you can actually wind up intervening, or when we started this thing, sort of like interceding to a certain degree. Like I wasn't doing it out of like, hey, you're doing this wrong, and watch me fix it for you or whatever. But just pointing out, like, hey, like I actually want you guys to succeed. But there was only so much I could do that because one, I was at a meeting for another thing, and this was a guest speaker. So if I speak at a turn and start becoming like maybe even a little bit argumentative with this person over how they're managing their company, which I have nothing to do with, and I am in a community where I am not one of the leaders, that it's out of place for me to do that, while also seeing that there is that aspect of not only are these people not there's a divide between their attention and what they should be attending to, and also the fact that the lady who is running this organization, she had set up her office. I had mentioned this was in an old convent, that her office is where she does the financial stuff and everything is inside an old confessional. So she's in what is normally like a sacred sacramental place that is meant for, discretion, and she is doing financial business in it essentially. And it's just like, like it's still got like the sliding divider and everything, and it's just like she's got that entire setup, and it's like, oh, there's a lot of this not using the office, like whether it's the title or physically the office, for what it's intended for. And that thing of like the accountants being at the top of the hierarchy, like that's exactly the case there. And you think of this aspect of, and I'm not saying that that's what this lady is, but using as a separate example that in the group of apostles, like Judas was the accountant, and he was a good one. He was skimming off the top, but he was skilled enough that, and people figured it out, obviously. But he had good business suggestions. It just wasn't aligned with the principle that everyone was supposed to be aligned to. If it was just a business venture, he was actually quite good at it. But there's that aspect that I mentioned in a previous session of like Peter getting a little too big for his britches right after getting his promotion, and then being told, get behind me, Satan. It's like, get in line. We're reasserting the hierarchy. You have your job. Like, yes, you have a position of authority over something, but that doesn't mean that you're calling all the shots or that you get to start, setting the orientation.
Mm. I like also this idea that Judas was the below that put himself as the head, right? And Peter tried to do that, but in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he did that out of love.
Well, they both did.
Right. Yeah.
But the problem is one of them did it, and the other one tried to do it through the right means and got called back, right? So there's a way that you can escalate up the hierarchy rightfully, even though you're Satan, right? Like you're at that point. But that's better than going to a different hierarchy and letting them sort things out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to close it down. We'll just do the first page of this, and then we'll go further. But I think maybe the suggestion that Danny had is interesting for our reflection, right? So there's something there with these categories and the way that they're used, and I think that's the source of a lot of our confusion, right? Like when we're trying to understand these things and relate to them, if we assume that the snake is bad, right, instead of that it's neutral or something, like maybe I did, then that has a lot of implications, right? And it's gonna taint the way that we receive the message. So yeah, I think that's a nice perspective for the reflection, and the telos that I want to have in the reflection is how can I take that to my life, right? So like how is my misrelating to categories also occurring in my life, and I can now make a change, right? And like I hope that we get some suggestions at the end of the reflection. So and everybody who's in the chat watching, please leave your questions so that we can also take them in. I hope that everybody got a fruitful reflection and that many strangers have entered and established new circles or spheres not allowed for new engagement. So who wants to go first?
Would you mind? I don't want to go first, but I was wondering, would you mind restating the topic again, just so I make sure that I have the way I have it formulated right? Like I've got the gist more or less, but
Well, the idea is that uh, our relationship to fundamental categories, right, or offices, the way that I describe them to myself, right? So the snake is an office that can be held by something, right? So it's a placeholder, it's a variable in some sense, right? And the variable is identified by its agency. Like what does it do? Um, and like we make mistakes in identifying these things and relating to them. So that was the question.
I can go first. What that made me think of was the role. that prayer plays within this for me, and the usefulness and that your orientation to what and how that variable should be received. I think prayer is a very useful thing for me for that.
Danny, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk a lot about. I mean, around we've been talking about in terms of relating to categories and how it modifies how you see the world or participate into it. I mean, one thing that just came to mind is that in order to resolve ambiguities, it's important to know what's most important and then look for it, and then you'll see it in the world. So, if you're intoxicated, what's most important will be different. The voice of what's most important could be, stronger, etc. But when you're making decisions in real time, which is kind of like when you're moving through the world, that's faith in action. You're doing new things, maybe with limited information. And so I think knowing what the thing is that's most important is, yeah, I guess that's kind of the bottom line of I guess this thesis from a lot of different angles in terms of roles you play with people, knowing who you are, defining boundaries, etc. Other simple things that came to mind were like in terms of relating to categories and how they, or like how they can how that like kind of like a serpent like thing. Self-criticism sounds like you're being humble with yourself, but it could actually be a manifestation of pride, right? You can always flip anything and just kind of say, who are you to criticize yourself? But other behavioral things like procrastination, for example, or perfectionism, I mean, can actually be, fear, like procrastination hiding as, masquerading as quality control, etc. So these are like serpents, right, that can hide around, and they can be difficult to see. Sometimes you can be blind to them, but yeah, I mean, a lot of these common emotional patterns do. But anyway, I've just been thinking about, yeah, like knowing what's important and then like moving through the world in real time. I could go on, but that's good enough. Let's see, who else wants to go?
Castle wants to. Or
Castle.
Christopher, do you want to go?
No, I'm actually being called away. I need to jump off and get going doing other things real quick. But
Okay.
unfortunately,
It's great seeing you.
I will see you all later.
God bless.
See ya.
Castle, you want to leave?
So I'm thinking about this a bit. So this thing of my sort of relationship to a lot of things has been kind of changing lately, and I liked what you mentioned about the serpent being a sort of like a psychopomp. So when I think of psychopomp, I think of kind of like the Greek mythology, like the ferryman of the dead, in a sense. This kind of guy that, as you said, kind of transports spirits in a sense, or he kind of gets people moved from one place to another. But there's also a good aspect of that. Like you have like the Saint Christopher who travels people across the river, and he not only can't but like won't be integrated under most circumstances. Like it's just not going to happen, and he refuses outright. But then you also get this kind of you get this sort of aspect of these different characters, like the Archangel Saint Michael, for example, who throughout tradition is not only the he was essentially the trigger man on the plagues of Egypt, but also the one who did like the official procession for like the Assumption of Mary. So you have this kind of like dual aspect of it's just like this extreme transition of this particular person. And so I was thinking with respect to a lot of the things that I've been doing, where like I'm involved in a lot of different places but don't actually have like a title in anything, and I'm fine with that. But there's this interesting aspect of like a few people have recently told me not that I'm part of their organization, but that I have a permanent invitation to visit. Like they actually said something to that effect, like the word permanent invitation, but also like not really being a part of it was actually something communicated to me multiple times this week. And that's something that I'm kind of thinking is like there's advantages and disadvantages to when you don't really have the same sort of freedom of being the outsider, but also being willing to be integrated. So there's that aspect of there's the forceful integration if you don't want to be part of something, but also if it's something that's rightly ordered, being able to submit to something that even if you're not officially part of it, being able to show up, and even if it's as a sort of transitional figure, maybe not just kind of like, oh, you're going to be there for a little while and then never again, but if you're kind of like a doorman in a sense of like, okay, you're going to be right here, you're going to let people in and let people out, maybe you can go in and go out as you please type of thing, and being comfortable with that and being willing to have your station changed for you, um, and kind of allowing for whatever sort of growth or challenges come with that. I'm still kind of processing it a bit, but I think it's related to that thing of like the get behind me. Like you don't even have to get to the Satan part. It's just, are you able to just get in line? Like, you know, can you fall in line? And if a responsibility is given to you, can you just kind of accept that, okay, if someone has said, hey, I need you to do this, or hey, you're the guy for this because, you know, maybe there's no one else to do it and you're right there. Can that be something that you can accept as like, maybe like God has just has permitted this to happen, that you have this responsibility that has shown up. Can you just take it and then, you know, accept that maybe the category that you're used to operating in is not the one that you're supposed to be operating, at least for right now.
Yeah, that reminds me of the parable where it has the two sons, and one of the sons says, yes, I'll do it, but he doesn't end up doing it, and the other one says, no, and he ends up doing it.
Yeah.
And like everybody seems to get this one wrong intuitively. Like just it messes with people really bad. If you want to get people to go upside down, you show them this guy, right? But I think that's what you're talking about, right? Like why is the first one the correct one? Because he submits to the authority. Authority first and then implementation. You can't implement without authority. like that's just randomness. And so you can't build anything. So even if the manifestation doesn't happen, you still need to adhere to the authority and say, yes, I'll do it, right? And correction can happen in that frame. In the other frame, that correction can't happen because there's no accountability because you already denied responsibility.
I thought in that story there was a favorable response for the guy that says no to the dad and then changes his mind.
No, that's the problem.
Is
It's
not?
not favorable.
I have to go back and reread that one.
Yeah. Like everybody gets screwed up by that story. So it's interesting that you misread it, right? But yeah, that's cool.
I'm gonna make a note of that one, and then fight you next week.
I hope you're not gonna correct me because then I'll look like a fool there. So yeah, I had a lot of things come at me. So I don't know if I already mentioned this, but recognizing what is real, what's already there. So what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Like he had to yield to what was already real, right? So his whatever his frame was, his statue had to bend to reality. And I think this is where we make the mistake often. Like some things just already are, right? Like Israel was screwed up and the Babylonians were set to take it. Like that's already real, right? Like we can't change the reality. Like at a certain point, it just has to unfold, right? And I think that's the whole point of Jeremiah is like, no, like guys, like this already happened. Like we're too late. Like the escalatory ladder has been set in place, and all we can do now is to respond and take the right actions within the escalation, right, or within the flood. Like we can choose to make our own arcs, right? Like we can choose to be Noah, or we get to choose to get flooded. and die, right? Like that's basically the story of that thing, which is like, oh, that was a hard read for me. Um, so yeah, recognizing what's real, right? And only when we've acknowledged what's real, we can find out what to do. We can't find out what to do without knowing what's real. Like, because then we just end up moving pieces that are not at the place that we think they are or whatever, and pretending that we're playing chess. It's like that doesn't work. So um, now to go to my reflection, because this was to frame my reflection. Uh, it's not only us that has to die, also the categories have to die, right? Like we have to let our conceptions of things die so that they can be filled with what's in the world. They can be occupied by the spirits. I think that's maybe the right framing. Like, what is the spirit that is taking hold of the office that we're relating to, right? And and so if your category dies, that's I think that's what symbolism is, right? Like, 'cause like now you can have everything in that category as long as it stays true to the category, and like then you end up with symbolic thinking. So or you can say symbol instead of category. That's maybe better, but whatever. Um, yeah. So what happens there is that erects a structure or a constellation of participation. So like you end up with this constellation of offices relating and interacting with each other, and that is the thing that allows you to orient. Like, okay, if you use this structure, then you can define the relationships that are present, and you can act within those relationships properly, right? So um, that also allows you to be right without doubting yourself, right? So now that structure gives you the right relationship. So you don't have to doubt your relationship. You can just act out the relationship. And that resolves a whole lot of worry, like orienting where you're at, where the other's at. Like you don't have to account for it. You just have to take in the signals and process them appropriately. Um, and and in some sense, like don't hold me on the wording, but you can that's like a proceduralization while remaining contextualized, right? So you have a pathway of action. You have things to enact while remaining embedded in the environment, right? So that means that you're accounting for the things that are of importance in you. So like I'm just seeing the principle behind the symbolism, I guess, right? Um, and yeah, I kind of wanted to connect it to what Danny said about what's most important. Um, like there's two things that are important, right? Like one is where are you going, right? So there's something that allows you to plot out a pathway to your result, right? Like if is my action contributing to getting there or not? Because if it's not, then like that's not important. And the other part of that, like what is important, is things that are actually possible, right? You can't plot out an action that's impossible because then you're going to misapply yourself and you're going to end up wrecking things that uh, you shouldn't touch. Um, so yeah, and that's heaven and earth at some sense, right? Like the calling is the union in the future, the hope, and your agency is your flesh responding to that call. Um, and yeah, to bring in this idea that these offices they get they get held by spirits, right? So if you see an office held by a spirit, right, like that allows you to identify means of response, right? Like, so are you supposed to be defensive? right? Or are you supposed to be vulnerable? Are you like are you supposed to run, right? Like all of these things, they come as a spirit and as the relationship that you're in, right? So like maybe a bad spirit is not important or relatively unimportant unless it gets into a position of leadership or something, right? And then it's like, okay, like no, now this bad spirit is directing things, right? Like for example, the accountant that starts directing instead of the leader, right? So that's not a good spirit. Like that spirit should be somewhere else, and then it can be good, but not at the head. Um, and yeah, I think that allows you to identify importance, right? Because like you can see everything holds its right place, and if it deviates from the place and still acts in the same spirit, then something is wrong. Yes. No, that's something to chew on because I can't oversee those implications. So since there's no comments, I want to thank everybody for watching. Uh, Leave comments in the comment section. I think there was plenty to comment on. And one of the things that you can comment on is our amazing speed that we get through this book with. So okay, thanks for watching.
Well, thank you, Manuel.